Well, we're going to talk about how great thou art. Of course, I like to call it, how cool is God? I bet you have a lot of how cool is God stories, because I got a bunch of them. I know you do. But you know, I was thinking about it, and thank you, Greg, so much for reading our verse. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. That means you haven't even thought of it yet, and he's already thought of it. His ways are way better than yours, and here's how much difference. As high as the heavens are than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. Those are some pretty big statements. That God that we have come to worship today is telling us that he's really big. He actually knows everything, and yet he knows us. And he knows what you're thinking about, and he asks you to talk to him. Isn't that something? That's really something. He asks you to ask for help when you need it, and even when you don't. He asks for forgiveness, and you can ask him for guidance, and he's real. But some of these promises are pretty big. Don't you think that's kind of big, that he's... there's some pretty big stories in the Bible. Have you ever really thought about it? Well... How about creation? Whoa. Really? Really? He spoke, and a whole earth was created, and stars and suns, and whew, that's pretty big. That is big. Of course, my favorite part is we actually created human beings out of dirt. Wow, that's pretty cool. Now that's big. That's a pretty big story. And then let's look in the book he left us, of course, our Bible, and we have stories about how cool God is, besides being this amazing creator. How about this one? This is pretty cool. Yeah, I'd like to see you part that there ocean out there in front of you. Even the river, even if you could part the river, or perhaps a little tiny lake nearby. How about that? Moses raised his arms, and God said, yeah, I want you to go across. And the water parted and piled up on both sides. And they walked through in dry land. Now, I don't know if he air dried it or... The Bible says it was dry. I'm thinking mud and muck and yuck, but the Bible says it was dry land. Now, that's big. That's big. This is one of my favorite how cool is God stories. You probably remember Hezekiah. Actually, he was one of the good kings. There weren't too many of them, but he was one of the good ones, and he'd served God for a long time, and he became ill. Now, imagine if you'd like to hear these words from God directly through his prophet. In those days, Hezekiah became ill and was at the point of death. The prophet came to him, prophet Isaiah, and said, this is what the Lord says. Pay attention. Put your house in order because you're going to die. You will not recover. Whoa, Hezekiah didn't like that. He was still fairly youngish, I guess, something. Thought he shouldn't die quite yet. And so he begged God and said, would you please heal me? And bless God's heart. You know what he said to good old King Hezekiah? He said, I will add 15 years. Now, at this stage in my life, I'll take 15, thank you. That's pretty cool. So maybe Hezekiah was old too, I don't know. But he said, I will add 15 years, and I will deliver you and the city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend this city for your sake. Oh, you guys are reading it. For my sake. I'm going to do it so people know how cool I am. And for the sake of my servant David and your ancestors and all these times, and I'm going to do this for you, Hezekiah. You've been a good king, and we're going to do this. Oh, Hezekiah, he must have been pretty sick, because you know what he said. Well, how will I know for sure he'll do it? Now, we would never do that, of course, but... and Isaiah answered and said, this is the Lord's sign to you, that the Lord will do what he has promised. And so the Lord has a lot of patience with us, I must say. He said, okay, even asked him, he said, should the shadow go back forward 10 steps or should it go back forward 10 steps? What do you want, Hezekiah? Backwards or forward? You pick. I get a kick out. I'm so glad some of these stories are recorded the way they are. Because Hezekiah, he said, it's a simple matter for the shadow to go forward. It is. Well, anyway, Hezekiah thought it was. And he said, rather, no, have it go back 10 steps. Oh, isn't God cool? In fact, actually, in order for the shadow to go backwards, which Hezekiah asked for, the earth would have to stop turning for a few minutes. And that would happen what would happen if the earth did stop? Well, for one thing, we'd be drinking salt water because there would be a big tsunami. And if the earth stopped turning, all of the oceans would slop into the land. That's us, there's no, I forget your tsunami routes. You're not going to have time. Everything that wasn't bolted down would be torn. Okay, so, hey, he didn't stop the earth. You know what he stopped was the sun. He stopped the sun. Stopping the earth, whoopee-doo, but the sun, man, it's hot. How cool is God? Or how hot, I guess. Oh, so he performed 2 miracles for Hezekiah. Gave him 15 years of life, and stopped the sun, moved the sun back. In fact, he did it in such a way that it was noticed by people, of course, all around the world, of course. And it was enabled him to have an opportunity to witness. I won't finish that story because, it didn't finish quite as well as we'd hoped. But kings came to visit, and, well, anyway, let me tell you another cool story about how cool God is. Now, this is big stuff. I couldn't do that, and you couldn't do that. That's pretty neat. How about when Jesus came? Now, 5,000 men, each one probably brought a woman. Don't you imagine at least 2 kids each? This was 20+ thousand people that he fed with a couple of fish and a couple of loaves of bread. Oh, come on. That's pretty big. That's pretty cool. That is so cool. That's a big story. I like it. Did you ever find yourself saying, really? Really? Well, I did. I knew these stories since I was a kid. They were pretty cool. And I learned to pray to Jesus and talk to him. And I can remember that after I knelt down in front of my couch and put my head down and prayed, I felt better. But once in a while, I would come up from praying and think, but you know what? I'd feel better if I talked to my friend, too, Huh. Okay, well, meet you tomorrow. And I used to imagine that all these amazing stories that I read in the Bible happened way back then, not today. And one day, I got a phone call, and it was my mama. And my mama said, we're okay, honey. We're okay, what does that mean? My mama told me a story I'm going to share with you today. My dad was a fisherman. He spent a lot of time out there in that ocean in front of you guys. He ported out of Westport, but spent well over 50 years, 60, 70, something, not 70, but good 60 years fishing out there. Long time. Bless their hearts. Of course, they're both gone now, but Mama told me this story, and it started out with my dad. It was the winter time, and of course, not much fishing going on in the winter, you know that. I don't think there's much fishing season left at any time, is there, around here anymore? Back in these days, you used to be able to fish. Anyway, so Mom was at a prayer meeting, and Dad had a friend that was, he was an Adventist fellow, and he lived in Montana, and he decided he wanted to become a fisherman, and so he had bought a boat, and Boy, it didn't take him very long to figure out he didn't want to be a fisherman. The boat's name was the Banner. And he called my dad in winter, it was February, and he called and said, Frank, I'm going to put that boat up for sale, and if you don't mind, it's over there at it's at Westport, and I'm going to have an ad going in the paper, and we need to have you bring the boat around to Tacoma, and I'm gonna sell the boat. I'm done with fishing. But I can't get out there to bring the boat around. Would you mind? The ad's going to start on Sunday, and if you'd go down and it'd take you a couple of days to get around the peninsula, but if you wouldn't mind. My dad said sure, he'd do that for his friend. So he went down to where my mom was at the prayer meeting and said, Martha, I need to be gone a couple of days. He explained what he was going to do. And so I'll be back. And so he went out the door, and Mom stood up and went after him and said, no, I'll go with you. Really? I wasn't like her to, why would she want to be in a boat okay, sure, he was happy about that. So off they went. They went down to the dock and checked over the Banner and noticed that he had actually rented the boat a couple of years and before he decided to sell it, and the people that had rented it had pretty much taken everything that was of value off of it. Things like anchors, dinghies, radios, fishing line, hooks. So my dad took a look at this anchorless, radioless boat and decided this wasn't a good idea. But he thought they would do it. They'll be okay. So they bought a couple of bags of groceries, some bread and butter and peanut butter, I'm sure. And they went on board the Banner. So they struck out from Westport and got out, headed north, got out a ways and headed up. And it was less than an hour that they were a sail when this huge noise occurred down in the engine room. Oh my goodness. Well, I don't know very much about engines except that something flywheel went through some fly rod through, I don't know. It was broke, and it was broke good. It wasn't fixable. My dad had been around these motors a long time and engines, and then he couldn't fix it. Well, of course, then you get on the radio. Oops. You call for help because you're adrift at sea in February. Nobody knows you're out there except the guy that's asked you to bring the boat in. He won't tell anybody till Sunday, and his boat isn't there. Your kids don't know. Your wife is with you. This isn't looking too good. Well, for some reason, they'd left this silly little old CB radio on board. That good old ship to shore was gone, but the CB radio was there, and it was crackling, and when a boat's not running forward, it just wallers in the trough, back and forth and back and forth. Their only hope was this radio. And so my dad, even though he was getting up in years, he decided that he needed to work on the antenna. Well, you know where they put the antennas? Up on the top of the poles. So against my mother's pleading, he went up the ladder and went up the pole and tried to jerry-rig up a new antenna, and he worked on it for quite a while, and no luck. He came back and said, we're really in a pickle here. Nobody knows we're here, and we're in trouble. So Dad got out there was a few charts there, and he got them out and wanted to keep track of where he was. And he said, if it looks like, in a month or so, we'll end up off the Aleutian Islands. Mom was so hoping to go to Hawaii. Well, they immediately knew they had to go on a diet because they didn't have enough food for a couple of months, and so it didn't look too good. Well, later that evening, they were drifting out into the shipping channel. Well, that's good because there's some traffic. Even though it's not fishing season, the ships go. But wouldn't you know that the longshoremen were on strike? And so there was only tankers, and they were few and far between that would be using the shipping channel. They didn't require the longshoremen. And so they watched, and it was getting dark, and sure enough, along comes a ship. Well, this is going to work out great. He's going to come near enough, and my dad had rigged up an old broom that he had a match ready to light to let him know he was in trouble. And when the ship got within range, he lit up his broom and waved it like crazy, and the ship just kept going. Now, they don't have a very big crew on board, but just one of them had to just look slightly sideways, and he didn't know there was somebody in trouble, but no, went right by, so he stamped out the broom. They got on the other side of the shipping channel, and it was dark now, and sure enough, another one came. Okay, Lord, my mom prayed and prayed. You own the cattle on 1,000 hills, and I know you know we're here, and I know you, and thank you for sending this one. I know this is the answer. And Dad got ready with his broom, and when the ship got close, now it's dark, the broom would show up really well. And sure enough, closer and closer, and he lit it up, and they also went on without seeing him. So they were in kind of trouble. And my dad had found some line, nothing to catch fish with, to eat, but he rigged up a lead line, and for a while he could kind of tell where they were by the fathoms. But they kept drifting further out, and he knew the currents, and they were in for a long haul. No one knew they were there, and they were in trouble. But God knew they were there, and Mom prayed and Dad prayed, and they prayed together, and they read verses, and they strengthened each other. The next day was kind of rough, and wasn't much to do except pray. Well, it started getting dark again, and Mom was laying in a bunk that had a porthole by the bunk, which was nice for her, and of course there's nothing out there. There's not even a fishing boat out there, nothing. And after a while she saw a light, a flash of light. Oh, Frank, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Oh, he wasn't asleep. There's light. This is the second night now they're out there. And Dad said, well, hold on. Of course, the boat's rocking like crazy, back and forth, and the swells are pretty big. And so he went outside, and he was gone quite a while, and Mom was really worried. And pretty soon he came, or after a while, he came back in, and he didn't say anything, and she said, oh, I saw it, there it goes again. Is it a fishing boat? What is it? And it was dark in the cabin, but Mama knew that his face wasn't very happy, because he said, it's a lighthouse. A lighthouse? How did we get a lighthouse way out here? Well, apparently God had turned him around, unbeknownst to them, and they were headed to a lighthouse. That was pretty exciting, except they put those lighthouses on top of rocks. And while being adrift at sea isn't very much fun, at least it's not life-threatening at the moment. Landing on a pile of rocks could be kind of life-threatening. And so there's the excuse me. Storms were sea was getting pretty strong, and there was a light coming. Well, they kept getting closer and closer, and Dad knew by the light where they were at. He knew what lighthouse it was and where they were at. And they were headed pretty much toward it, or near it. And he got their life vests on, and My mother is not a lady of health. She has asthma and diabetes and a lot of things, and he knew that she was not going to survive this, and he was pretty sure he wasn't either. In fact, he knew he wasn't. There was no way they could survive landing on the rocks. And he says that they were braced with him on one side of the companionway and her on the other, and they were braced across each other, and they knew they'd be on the rocks before very long. And he said, "What do you pray when you know it's your last prayer?" Well, he said, "My kids don't need me, they're grown up." Of course, that wasn't true. "My wife will perish with me." So he promised God that if they would manage to figure out some way out of this, and he sure couldn't figure out what it would be, that he would tell other people what God had done. And so they neared the light. Of course, they could see the rocks pretty well, and then they could see, and Dad knew there was a bay there. If they could just miss those rocks, they could end up on the beach. That might be a better chance, at least. And starting to get light, just a tiny bit. Well, God did step up and said, "Okay, now it's my time. Now it's my turn. Those ships that passed, no, those weren't for you. It's my turn. I want to do something special." The boat turned, and the bow went directly into the oncoming waves. Now, even a good pilot would have a little hard trouble keeping it exactly on course with the bow out to sea, but that's exactly what happened. There was no sound from the engine room, just the horrific sound of the waves crashing. And my dad explained that the waves would split exactly in half as it hit the bow. Now, you fishermen around here know that that's not the way boats work. So the boat turned, bow out to sea, and suddenly there was a grabbing, pulling feeling as they could tell the boat was hitting something. Well, later they found out they crossed 7 gravel bars before they ended up on the Tahola Indian Reservation, way north of the normal route, or where there's roads out there in the middle of nowhere on the peninsula. And finally they were on the beach. Well, having a big fishing trawler on the beach doesn't mean you're on the beach yet. It means you got some waves between you and the beach before you. And my dad knew they were going to be okay. Look what they'd just gone through. And but he was concerned about getting Mom overboard this boat on the beach and getting her on to safety. But so just getting light, and he happened to notice that even though there was no civilization around, there was a tiny little road down there, and it was really, really early in the morning, and he could see the headlights of a pickup truck on this road. And he could see then, as it got lighter, that there was an antenna on this pickup truck. And he thought, maybe this CB radio will work. And he gave it a try, and that was the only time it did work. And he told the Indian that had come down to gather firewood that he could help some people out. And they managed to get a call into this Astoria station just up the road from here. And sure enough, when you watch that helicopter rise up out of the valley there, and I've seen it many times, you never know where it's headed. Well, this day it was headed to pick off a couple of old people off a boat. And you know what they do when they pick you off a boat like that? They send out a basket. My mom is so cute. She built a lot like her daughter here. Or let's say I caught up with her, whichever way. She didn't like the idea of getting in the basket. She remembers watching people being rescued by baskets and off of cliffs, and she'd say, "Man, I think I'd have to die on the cliff. I don't think I could get in a basket like that." Well, before the basket came down, the Coast Guard had to come up on shore, and a couple of Coast Guard boys came out to walked out to the boat and wanted to make sure everybody was okay, and he was there to help with the basket as it came down. And Sure enough, it came down, and Mother knew she had to get in the basket, and she got in the basket, of course, and all of a sudden, every weight was lifted. She felt great. Started bringing her up into the helicopter, and she looked overboard, and she could see the banner sitting there on the beach. And, of course, they were both rescued. The Coast Guard said, wow, how did you ever get that boat that far? There's 7 gravel bars there. See that wreck and that one? It's impossible to get a boat on the beach. Well, you know, God is pretty cool. And my father had been a fisherman out there for a long time, known by a lot of people who thought he was just a little bit crazy because every Saturday he'd go behind a rock or go to town and go to church, and they'd be on the fish, and they thought that was the stupidest way to fish, where you have to take one day off and it had to be a certain day. I'm pretty sure God got some credit for this one up and down the coast. Yeah. God doesn't always fix everything when we want it. They wouldn't have minded at all if one of those freighters had said, hello, need some help? There's another story in the Bible I kind of like, the story of Joseph. You remember Joseph. Bless his heart. He was a favored boy, and at 17 he was sold as a slave into Egypt, and so he was thrown in a pit, and then he was bought by Potiphar, and then he spent 13 years as a prisoner or a slave. 13 years, that's a long time. Before long, he had an opportunity to interpret a dream, and he was able to tell that there was going to be 7 years of famine. You remember this story. Told them to store it up so they could get through this famine. Oops, just a minute. And next thing you know, he's made the ruler next to Pharaoh as a ruler, and then he gets to get back with his family. That's a pretty amazing story, but you know what? If you really think about that story, the timing, it's pretty long times there. He was about 30 when he was made the overseer. He was about 39 when his brothers first came to see him. Probably in his early 40s when they came the second time and brought his dad. And then he lived to 110 when he died. That story that we just looked at of Joseph took a long time, didn't it? There are a lot of pieces. Joseph remained faithful and recognized God as the one in charge, and I won't be telling him when he has to do it. He's going to tell me. God is pretty cool. My favorite miracle story is not the story of the sea, even though that was an amazing story in my life. It saved my parents' lives. Favorite story is when God changes a person. This is my sister and her new husband, Dave. I'm going to tell you a quick story about Dave. Dave was an alcoholic chain smoker who was mean as the dickens. And why his wife Ann stayed with him for 50 years, even the kids didn't know. He was mean. They were afraid of him. Well, before Ann died, I had an opportunity to follow God's direction and go meet Dave and get him involved in some Bible studies. What was really cool, though, is we just started having Bible studies, and I couldn't believe he even let us do that. And he had this pain in his heart. It felt like a heart attack. That day, Dave quit smoking and quit drinking. One day. That doesn't always happen. I like it when that's cool. And if you struggle with either of those, you know that's a struggle. But Dave stopped. And who would have guessed he was a nice guy? He's a pussycat. In fact, when his wife Ann did pass away a few years later, and by the way, she wrote me a letter at least three or four times a year, just a thank you note. Thank you for giving me a husband. Oh, so it wasn't me. We knew it. Well, then, because he was such a nice guy, and I had a single sister, I had to meddle, and this is her new husband. Trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. And don't worry about your own understanding. You probably got it wrong anyway. In all your ways, acknowledge him, whether the boat goes by or stops or waves or doesn't. Whether you have to spend 13 years in prison for something you didn't do or not. He will make your path straight. He's got your back. He's so cool. He is so cool. The good gifts come from God. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. I don't care how hard you worked. It's not yours. He gave it to you. And cometh down from the Father. And Greg, can I share this verse one more time? For my thoughts are not your thoughts. Never does it the way we think he should, does he? Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. How great thou art, God. How cool are you.